People are still being held hostage tonight aboard a hijacked Afghan airliner at Stansted Airport in Essex. Police say they're determined to end the crisis peacefully and have been negotiating throughout the day in English with the hijackers. Earlier, 8 people were released. It's still unclear what the hijackers are demanding. The plane took off yesterday morning from the Afghan capital, Kabul, on a domestic flight. After several stops, including Moscow, it landed at Stansted at 2 o'clock this morning. Our chief news correspondent, Kate Adey, is there.
There have been few outward signs of the ordeal being undergone by the passengers. The Boeing 727 is tucked into a corner of Stansted Airport, well away from the main runway. However, it's being watched and circled by the special forces who might be called on if the situation were to deteriorate, with the lives of 150 people at risk. People who've spent well over 24 hours cooped up in the cramped cabin of a Boeing 727. The passengers and crew should have spent a mere hour on a flight between 2 Afghan cities yesterday. Instead, they found themselves embarked on a grim shuttle, ending up at Stansted Airport just after 2 this morning. Ariana Airlines, far from home, taxied past a large number of emergency vehicles, which had quickly gathered following well-rehearsed procedures specific to this airport. The Afghan plane had unexpectedly headed to London from Moscow, and its weary and presumably frightened passengers found themselves looking at the Essex countryside. A handful of people had been allowed off in Russia and Uzbekistan, but the plane was still very full, with 23 children on board. During the day, one good sign was that negotiators had been able to talk to the plane in English and alleviate some of the conditions on board. A generator, some tea and soft drinks, baby food and toiletries. A Land Rover crept up with the requested supplies. But any political demands the hijackers may have made have not been put to the British police.
I'm not aware of any other requests that have been made by the people on board the aircraft. As far as I know, at this time, the only requests that have been made are for food, fresh water, medical supplies and equipment.
Mid-morning, a family of 4 plus another man were released. Then the police said negotiations were at a critical stage, but didn't explain. Meanwhile, Stansted Airport has functioned in a restricted manner, with some flights cancelled. But later, officials said that the airport was 90% operational. Hot food was taken up the rear steps of the plane this afternoon, and 3 more passengers released. Otherwise, there was little obvious activity, and with the plane unlikely to fly off, British policy is to deal with the situation here. Hours of continued negotiation lie ahead. Not surprisingly, the physical conditions on board the aircraft have been described as difficult. However, the family who came off this morning said they had been well treated. But little has emerged about the mood of the hijackers, whether or how they are armed, and what their intentions are. Kate Adey, BBC News, Stansted.
It's still not clear exactly who the hijackers are or even who they're acting for. Rival factions in Afghanistan have traded claims and denials about which group is holding the hostages. It's thought one of the hijackers' key demands is the release of an opposition leader being held by the Islamic Taliban authorities inside Afghanistan.
Afghanistan has always been fought over. It's still in the grip of civil war. And the Taliban, who now control most of the country, own the Stansted plane. The hijackers seem to be allied to the anti-Taliban forces, still clinging on to a corner of the country. And it's the release of one of their military heroes the hijackers apparently demand. Ismail Khan has spent half a lifetime at war, but then Ismail Khan was captured and imprisoned in 1997. He's still the Taliban's greatest prize.
Last year, he nearly died in jail. The Taliban refused to let doctors see him. He's frail, he's 60 years old, he's not keeping good health. And these hijackers could well be his clan members, members of his family, or his supporters.
The Taliban must be expected to keep hold of their most celebrated prisoner. They have successfully destroyed what they see as Western decadence. The Taliban is shunned by most of the outside world and accused of supporting terrorism. But now it's the Taliban's enemies who are linked to the hijacking, leaving them as friends of the West trying to disown the hijackers.
Our movement have never been involved in such activities. Not only that we have not been involved, but we have all the time opposed this sort of terrorist activity. That's a total terrorist activity. We have opposed it in the past, we are opposing it now, and we will oppose it in the future.
Whoever the hijackers really are, it was the success of another hijack which may have given them the idea. Last December, an Indian Airlines plane was forced to fly to Afghanistan. The hijackers freed their hostages after India did release 3 Kashmiri militants from jail. But Britain insists the hijackers at Stansted have made a big mistake. The government never makes concessions, never allows hijackers to go free. Still, the politics of this case are extremely complex. Afghanistan's embassy here in London is home not to the Taliban, not recognised by Britain, but to the Afghan opposition, strenuously denying any links to the hijackers. All this leaves the authorities relying on negotiation without concession to try to end the hijack peacefully. James Robbins, BBC News, at Afghanistan's embassy in London.
The hijackers holding the Afghan plane at Stansted Airport have released a 9th hostage. The man was reported to be suffering from asthma, but there's still little information about the identity of the hijackers or indeed their demands. Kate Adie is at Stansted Airport.
The only visible hint of some progress today, and that negotiations on practical matters at least are working. A passenger leaving the plane this afternoon. He went towards one of several police vehicles which are dotted around the aircraft at a distance. The man had felt unwell and had had breathing difficulties. Otherwise, it was a day of toing and froing, with armed police approaching the aircraft with food, water and medicine. Hard facts about what's going on inside and why people are still on the plane are not being made available. The police have reiterated their desire that a peaceful conclusion is reached, but have again given no information as to who the hijackers are and what they want.
I wouldn't want to jeopardise anybody's safety, but at this time, all I can tell you is that there have not been any specific requirements made or demands made that I am aware of.
But are there perhaps demands he has not been told about?
That would be speculation, but that may be true, yes.
And if so, there may well have been threats and deadlines with the potential for violence, accounting for the presence of anti-terrorist police units nearby, backed up by special forces. All the police will say is that those on board have been treated pretty well, though the conditions are increasingly unpleasant. It all adds up to a curious situation where the conventional information, what do these people want and what will they do to get it, are not publicly available. All this against a background of high security and concern for people's safety. And as the plane and its passengers face another night of discomfort, there's nothing to dispel the suggestion that this might be a lengthy operation. Kate Adie, BBC News, Stansted.
Essex police say they now have a clearer picture of who's on board the hijacked plane. They estimate there are 8 armed hijackers holding 156 passengers. Even though there are special forces on standby at the airport, the police strategy for dealing with the situation seems to be to ensure a peaceful outcome, however long it takes.
This is a hijack in its 3rd day where many of the most basic details remain unclear. During the day, there has been a huge effort by the authorities to define what they're really dealing with. Reports from the Afghan capital, Kabul, have only added to the confusion. Their officials insist the hijackers have made no political demands. There were even reports from airline staff that the hijackers may be seeking asylum and that there might be close family links between those on board. Here at the Foreign Office, they've been trying to decipher these pieces of information from a regime it has no official links with. British diplomats have met with Afghan officials, but only in neighbouring Pakistan, not the ideal channel through which to manage a crisis. Today, 2 teams of negotiators have been trying to build a relationship with the hijackers, while psychologists have been analysing their statements in an attempt to assess not just their state of mind, but what they want.
The negotiators now are very much intent on finding out what the real aims of the hijackers are and, crucially, to what extent they're prepared to compromise. On that basis, we may begin to see some talk of a settlement being developed between the negotiators and the hijackers in the next 24 hours or so.
Certainly the technology now exists that enables the police to monitor what is happening inside the plane. Even so, the authorities' room for manoeuvre will also be influenced by the mental state of the passengers. One man who endured a hijack at Frankfurt said, "Fear never goes away."
We held hands, we sort of looked at each other, and going through our minds were, what happens if the worst happens?
In all of this, knowledge is the key, knowing when to apply pressure, when to hold back. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News.
151 hostages are spending their fourth night on board the hijacked Afghan Boeing 727 at Stansted, making this the longest hijacking on British soil. This evening, 4 men, one of them carrying a gun, were seen outside the plane. Last night, 4 crew members escaped from the cockpit. They spent much of the day being debriefed by police.
Late this afternoon, 4 men appeared down the rear steps to collect the food and water left by the police near the tail of the plane. 3 of them worked swiftly to carry the supplies, the whole operation negotiated in advance. They were watched over by a 4th man with a gun in his hand. He was wearing traditional Afghan dress and appeared to cover his face, as he motioned to one of the men loading to go with him. They set off to walk round the aircraft, the gunman peering up and inspecting the fuselage. It's not clear if the second man is one of the hijackers or is being made to walk at gunpoint. Earlier, any faint hopes the hijackers might have had that flight was an option ended when the captain and 3 of his crew escaped. Using a rope, standard equipment for emergency exit from the cockpit, the 4 men were swiftly on the ground and heading for the police vehicles nearby. The hijackers hadn't noticed what was happening, and a few minutes elapsed before the police negotiators heard the atmosphere get agitated.
The escape of the flight crew in the early hours of the morning upset the calm nature of the negotiation. We'd worked really hard right through to the early hours of this morning, perhaps 6, 7 o'clock, to get the conditions back on the plane calm, to open the negotiations in a business-like manner.
Things were somewhat up and down for some hours. Then, without warning, the rear steps of the plane were lowered and a figure appeared to fall down. A flight attendant had been pushed out, suffering minor grazes. With 5 people able to describe the situation, the police presumably have a much more detailed picture, though they'll say no more than there are between 6 and 10 hijackers armed with handguns. The police have described the hijackers as very determined, but there's little indication as to what they're determined about. At one point, their demands were said to be vague and hard to pin down, and suggestions have ranged from pressure on the government in Afghanistan to requests for asylum here in Britain. Kate Adey, BBC News, Stansted.
Good evening. 4 days after it began, Britain's longest hijack crisis is over. At 3 o'clock this morning, a group of women and children stepped off the plane they'd boarded in Afghanistan last Sunday. By 6, all those on the plane were in police custody. During the day, detectives have been trying to find out just how many of those on board were involved in the hijack. 74 passengers have applied for asylum. But the Home Secretary, Jack Straw, pledged to consider the applications personally and said that he was determined to send a clear message that no one should benefit from hijacking. From Stansted, Gavin Hewitt reports.
The first indication that the hijacking might be ending came at 2 o'clock this morning, when unusually the cabin lights came on. Moments later, a man came down the back steps and collected a package left by the police. This contained 2-way radios to help complete final negotiations. Shortly after, 2 of the hijackers left the plane for a face-to-face meeting with the police. The hijackers wanted reassurances about their safety. Then, just after 3 in the morning, police vehicles moved to the steps of the plane. Marksmen could be seen training their guns on the door. Then a woman appeared, the tiny shape of 2 children, until a line of veiled women and their families spread out against the bitter wind blowing off the Essex countryside. Then, just before 6 o'clock, a second group of men filed from the plane, some with their hands in the air. The police had wanted to separate the men from the women to make identifying the hijackers easier. Some were forced to lie on the ground before being marched away. Then the process began of deciding who were hostages, who were hijackers, and who might be friends of the hijackers. All were searched for weapons.
We've recovered 4 handguns,
5 knives, 1 knuckle duster, 2 detonators, and 2 grenades, but the grenades do not appear to have fuses in them.
As soon as it was light, forensic teams began examining the plane. All baggage was removed to see what it might reveal about the motives of passengers who were supposed to be on a short, internal flight. The inside of the 727 was found to be relatively tidy.
It's not in much disorder as we might have anticipated. It's remarkably quiet on there in terms of the amount of rubbish and debris there. We've taken that all away as it's been developing.
It was yet another indication that this was a different kind of hijacking. Incredibly, it was only in the final hour before the hijackers walked down the steps of the plane here that they began talking about anything that could vaguely be regarded as a motive. They suddenly mentioned the political situation back home in Afghanistan. The hostages were taken to an airport hotel. Some appeared relieved, even relaxed, after 4 days and nights inside a cramped plane. A woman without her veil talking to her friend. Others looked out on a strange land that some at least want to make their home.
They're very tired, you know, they're exhausted. They've been on the plane obviously for many hours and they're quite relieved, I think, to be off the plane, and they're in comfortable surroundings now, but certainly exhausted, I think is the word.
This appears to have been an organised bid for political asylum, an elaborate plan to escape the harsh fundamentalist regime of the Taliban. 21 people have been arrested. 60 passengers with 14 children have already asked for asylum. Those not suspected of involvement in this hijacking will be able to return to Afghanistan tomorrow on a charter plane. No one will be forced to leave immediately. Those who stay will be looked after by social services whilst their cases are considered. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News, Stansted.
The Home Secretary Jack Straw said he wanted all those who arrived on the Afghan plane removed from this country. In Afghanistan, the Taliban government praised Britain's handling of the crisis and called for the hijackers to be dealt with under British or international law. Our special correspondent Ben Brown looks at the prospects for the passengers and the hijackers.
This is the 4-star Hilton Hotel where passengers from the hijacked plane are now being put up. The rooms here can cost around £200 a night. It's a far cry from war-torn and poverty-stricken Afghanistan. But the asylum seekers won't be staying long in Britain if the Home Secretary has his way. Today he said that he personally will vet their applications. His aim is to send them straight back home.
I am determined that nobody should consider that there can be any benefit to be obtained by hijacking. Subject to compliance with all legal requirements, I would wish to see removed from this country all those on the plane as soon as reasonably practicable.
But the opposition want to know why the hijacked plane came to Britain in the first place. Was it because we're considered a soft touch?
Why did it decide that it would land here and try and take advantage of our asylum procedures? Is it that those procedures are known to be rather more congenial than some which appertain in other countries?
The men who carried out the last hijack at Stansted are still in Britain 4 years on. They were Iraqis who claimed they were seeking refuge from Saddam Hussein. They were cleared by the Court of Appeal, but the lawyer for some of them insists theirs is no life of luxury.
One of the gentlemen is actually living with friends, basically on the floor. He's in receipt of food vouchers to the value of approximately £30, which is the only thing that he's actually receiving. It doesn't enable him to travel anywhere. He's unable to seek employment, which has restricted him. He has no relatives here. He's basically living a very isolated life.
Even so, it may be better than life in Afghanistan, which has endured 2 decades of civil war, which is one of the poorest nations on earth, and which is ruled by a hardline Islamic regime, the Taliban. Since they came to power, the number of Afghans seeking asylum here in Britain has soared from a few hundred in 1996 to nearly 4,000 last year. Only a fraction of these have actually been given the status of refugees, but significantly many are told they have a temporary right to stay. Under police guard tonight, the Afghans here in Stansted will each have to prove they would be persecuted if they go back home. The asylum seekers now face a nervous wait to find out whether or not they can stay in Britain. If indeed they had seen this country as a soft touch, Then the Home Secretary is determined to prove them wrong. The last thing he wants is for this bizarre episode to set a precedent and for Stansted to become the hijack capital of the world. Ben Brown, BBC News, Stansted Airport.
73 passengers and crew from the hijacked Afghan plane are now back in Afghanistan. They left behind another 70 who want to stay here. Those who made the journey home were given a very warm welcome by the officials of the Taliban government. They also demanded that Britain prosecute and punish the hijackers. Our correspondent Owen Bennett-Jones reports now from Afghanistan.
After 9 days travelling halfway around the world and back, those who wanted to return are now back in Afghanistan. After all the delays, they touched down in the southern Afghan city of Kandahar. When they got off the plane, the hostages said that they had been beaten by the hijackers and that the whole purpose of the seizure of the plane was to secure asylum in Britain.
Their demand was just to stay in the kingdom or in British country. So with their 40% family, which was included children and women, this was their own demand.
The Taliban foreign minister and United Nations officials were on hand to welcome the freed hostages. Gifts were given out, turbans for the men, cloth for the women, and for the children, some flowers. It was the type of reception the Taliban had promised. Just over a week ago, the Afghan passengers were on a short domestic flight. Eventually, their journey took them to Central Asia, Moscow and London. But they are now back in their own country, and UN officials say they'll try to help them move from Kandahar to their homes.
Owen Bennett-Jones reporting there. Here, 13 Afghan men have appeared in court in Southend, charged with hijacking the plane which arrived at Stansted last week. Essex police say they've also arrested another man who's now being questioned. More details from Joshua ROZENBERG, who's in Southend. Joshua, what happened in court?
Well, all 13 men were remanded in custody by the stipendiary magistrate. The last of them left the court here just a few moments ago. They're all due back in court in 4 weeks' time. One or two of them exercise their right to be back in court a little sooner. They were all dressed in regulation police-issued tracksuits. The two of them shared a surname. They might have been brothers, and all of them had little stickers on their jackets with their names on. They were all bearded, they were young, they were surprisingly relaxed, given the very serious charges that they face.
And talk us through the process that they do now face, Joshua. What's likely to happen in the next few weeks?
Well, the charges they face are aircraft hijacking, contrary to the Aviation Security Act. That's a serious charge, as I say, carries a maximum penalty of life imprisonment on conviction. And because it's such a serious charge, it can't be tried by a magistrate here. So there'll be a process of further remands, and ultimately it'll be up to the magistrate to decide whether they should be sent for trial at the Crown Court, perhaps the Old Bailey or another court in the London area. But in the meantime, they will continue to appear in court, and as I say, they've been remanded in custody. None of the men applied for bail.
Joshua, thank you very much. 4 of England's